Today we're going to be looking at resistance, how we can honour it without giving into it. And resistance is something we all encounter. It can manifest mentally, emotionally, even physically when we're faced with tasks or situations or even energies that challenge us. Acknowledging the resistance is essential, yet it's equally important to ensure that we don't let it turn into procrastination. Welcome to Spiritual Midwife, the podcast that tenderly guides you through the transformative journey of spiritual awakening and personal development towards the ultimate destination of soul sovereignty. I'm Claire Atyeo, a medicine woman and dedicated guide to the profound realm of soul sovereignty, and you are listening to Spiritual Midwife. I'm going to share with you in this podcast a personal story that is just yesterday's. It's not even an old one, it's yesterday's. And my usual designated time to record this podcast is the day before it goes live. However, as yesterday started unfolding, I felt a significant amount of resistance. First resistance was the content that I'd prepared, that I'd planned. It didn't feel right. It didn't resonate with me as it had when I'd prepared it. Then I encountered a creative block and I was struggling to come up with an appropriate topic, which for me that is not a usual pattern. I'm usually quite quick to come up with alternatives when I'm being guided by the energies, by how I'm feeling emotionally, mentally and physically to come up with something. By the afternoon, I became consciously aware that I was in resistance, that I was resisting doing the podcast. And I had this light bulb moment that we all experience. And I was like, right, okay, we haven't covered resistance yet. It's resistance. The divine is showing me and giving me this resistance because I need to talk about resistance. It's something we all feel. But by 10 p.m, despite all my best intentions, I still hadn't recorded anything. And at that point, instead, I'd reviewed and I'd realized that I'd managed to do everything else, even down to contemplating cleaning the windows, putting off, procrastinating over the inevitable task of recording this podcast. The key here, and why I share this, is to highlight how our minds are fantastic at creating pathways that divert us from our intended destination. And living consciously involves being observant of these mental deviations, understanding that they are occurring. That's what brings us into the now, when we acknowledge what is occurring consciously in that moment and allowing ourselves the space for them to play out, but also being mindful that we're taking the scenic route rather than a direct route. So how did I deal with this last night? I had a conscious conversation with myself. I acknowledged that I was in resistance. And rather than berating myself or feeling guilty, I just allowed myself to surrender to it lovingly, unconditionally. I told myself it was okay. But I also made a commitment that I would record the episode today. Would it mean that it was a little bit late going out? Yes, it would. Was that a major issue? No. It's not as I would like to be, but it's also giving myself that flexibility, giving myself the permission to honor what is coming up in me. So surrendering doesn't mean giving up. It's about accepting where we are without judgment, whilst gently reminding ourselves of our goals, of our intentions, of the need to complete our tasks. And in this way, we honor our resistance without letting it turn into procrastination. And it's in that honoring that we start to teach ourselves that we are loved, that we are listened to, that we do respect ourselves. It's all very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that because we're in resistance, there is something wrong with us, or we're not doing as we should, or there's something that needs healing. And when resistance does show up, it's best to give it the space. And yes, we do need to at some point go back in and be reflective of, okay, why did that show up? What was going on? Very often it can have nothing to do with the task that you were doing, and your body, the energies that surrounded you were wanting you to look at a different aspect, area of your life that needed a little bit of intention. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a few tips now on how to navigate resistance when you feel it. And it is about navigating it. That surrender is navigating it. And even though we're surrendering, even though we're not effectively doing whatever task or whatever project that we're having resistance to, whatever we're having that resistance to, it can easily feel that we're not having forward movement. But when we surrender and we're navigating through it, that forward movement energetically is still in motion. So the first one is acknowledge it. Recognize the resistance. And if you can, in that moment, without going too deep and without sending yourself down a rabbit hole that you don't need to go down at that moment, identify it. Identify its source. Is it fear? Is it doubt? Is it perhaps a lack of clarity? Or is it something completely different? Yesterday's resistance, even though I didn't want to delve in it, was because of the energies that are around us. And we have some profound energies at the moment. We have the shadow aspects of the new moon on Sunday, Mercury retrograde that comes in fully on Sunday. We're in Lionsgate. And I believe Cryon is doing something as well. Or maybe Cryon moved 26th of July. So as Lionsgate opens, so Cryon moved as well. And so there's energetically, astrologically, there's a huge amount going on. And within that, there was energetic aspects within me that needed releasing, that needed reviewing, that needed introspection. And my higher self wanted me to dedicate more time to that, hence the resistance. So there can be a million different paradigms. If you can identify it at the time, perfect, fantastic. If you can't, don't get bogged down by that. Just put it in your journal or make a mental note that you actually go back to it to look at that. Create space for yourself. Give yourself permission to feel the resistance. Don't push it away or ignore it. Sometimes the resistance is a sign that we need to approach something differently. Sometimes it will be because we like for this podcast, for instance, it's a completely different topic than what I was going to be talking about. And yet that resistance that I felt, for sure, this podcast will help and touch the life of another who is also going to go through resistance or is going through resistance. Hold yourselves with self-compassion. Be kind to yourselves. Speak to yourselves in a compassionate and understanding way. And just remind yourself that resistance is a natural part of the human experience. And recommit. Once you've acknowledged and honoured your resistance, just gently recommit to your goal, to your project, to your task. Set it a new intention, a new timeline that feels more aligned. What you're actually doing is you are reprogramming the mind in that moment. You've surrendered to the resistance. You've listened to your body, your mind, your intuition, and you've surrendered to that resistance. But you're also telling the ego, okay, for whatever reason we went into resistance, and you may know, you may not at that moment, okay, ego, I'm going to give you the space, I'm going to give you the time that you need to feel more comfortable with what we're doing. But we are going to do X, Y, and Z by this time. And it's very much like how we teach children. When children are resistant and they don't want to go for their bath, or they don't want to go to bed, we say to them, right, you can have another 5 minutes. And what we're doing is we are telling the ego, their ego, yeah, that's okay, that's fine. You can have your way for 5 minutes more. And that's what we're doing when we go into resistance as adults. We are saying, that's fine, that's okay, but this is going to be done tomorrow, or this is going to be done by X. It's the small steps. Break it down. Break down your task if you need to. Break down that project if you need to, so that the ego, your emotions, are more comfortable and it feels more manageable. It looks less daunting. It looks less scary, especially if it's fear that's coming up, especially if it's something that you've never done before and it is a resistance. So those false self-beliefs, because that's what you're still working through. You're still building that confidence. You're still building that self-worth and that self-value. And what project you have on the go, your whole being is going into resistance and screaming on the inside, no, no, no. Break it down. Just break it down. Break it down into small bite-sized pieces that you can go, okay, yeah, okay, ego, I know you're scared. So what we're going to do this bit first, as you would with a child. Children, learning from children is brilliant, because I always used to say when my daughter was little, you didn't come with a rule book. And so I was winging it. And I found on the soul sovereignty journey that the majority of the time we're winging it. We are teaching ourselves and nurturing ourselves and nurturing our inner child and holding space for those fears, for those misconceptions, for the things that we felt that we lacked. And it's learning to give that to yourself. And you can only do that when you become consciously aware of how things are playing out in your life. AKA, like yesterday, I didn't clock it immediately. I'm not going to lie. I didn't clock immediately that I was in resistance to doing the podcast. It was only as the day progressed and then I became consciously aware that actually that was what I was doing. I was resisting doing it. And by allowing myself the space, by being compassionate with myself, by saying to myself, okay, all right, I can see what you're doing. You really don't want to do this today, but we are going to do it tomorrow. We are going to do it tomorrow. The same as you would a child. Okay, you don't want to do that, but this is something you need to learn. This is something you need to know. This is something you need to be able to do. Like a child who's frightened of water and you need them to learn to swim for their own safety because you have a pool in your backyard, for example. And so you do it, you break it down into little steps for them. And this is what we need to do with ourselves. We have huge expectations of ourselves as we grow into adults. And yet our emotional, our mental, our physical responses to fears are exactly the same as a child's. And yet when we have a small child in front of us, we offer it that compassion. We find those solutions. We automatically break it down into bite-sized pieces. And yet we don't offer ourselves that same compassion as adults. And that's what we need to be doing. That's what we need to be doing for ourselves. That's what we need to be doing when dealing with other adults. Is to break it down, to recognize that whatever they're being resistant to, there is something, be it a fear, be it a lack of knowledge, be it a false belief, there is something that is holding them back. So I hope me sharing the story of this podcast creation has helped and assisted you guys in some way to understand what resistance is, to understand that yes, we should be honouring that, but in the same vein, we shouldn't be giving into it. You have been listening to Spiritual Midwife. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.